Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the third in our series of the leadership special series we have. Today is our election special, and we're joined by panellist Pat Leahy, political editor of the Irish Times, and Sarah Carey, broadcaster and columnist. So I'm going to pass you over to our Director General, Mark Garrett, as our moderator this afternoon. And not forgetting, excuse me, our Director of Policy, Dr. Brian Hunt, also on the panel. Thank you very much. The view I'm having, he's further out of my eye line. I do apologise. Over we go. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Forgotten Brian, but still here, I'm glad to say. Look, thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate it. This is the latest in our series of leadership conversations, and we have three great leaders with us here. Pat Leahy has been introduced, obviously, as political editor of the Irish Times, but probably more importantly, he misspent 3 years in UCD studying law and has gone on to greater things ever since. And Sarah Carey, obviously, again, journalist, columnist, and commentator. And as she said herself, her greatest experience of the law has been on the wrong side of the law on many an occasion, which we can probably all empathise with in many ways. And we have Brian, obviously, Brian Hunt, our Director of Policy here in the Law Society, who will take us through some of the priorities from the Law Society's point of view in this election as well. But we're here to talk about the election, and I know we're all, I think, maybe beginning to engage with what's happening in the political world a bit more than we were a couple of weeks or a couple of months ago. This day next week, there will be an election for the next Dáil and the next government. And I suppose just to maybe, if we were having this conversation a year ago, we probably would have been considering that the core of this government, the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael majority within the government, would be contesting with Sinn Féin to lead the next government. A lot seems to have changed in that last year. Maybe I'll start with that question to Pat. I mean, are you seeing any change to that? Is that really playing out on the ground and in this campaign so far?
Yeah, hi, Mark, and hello, everybody, and delighted to be here. Yeah, I think like you put it in a nutshell there. If we're having a conversation a year ago, the political landscape looks completely different. And a lot of that has got to do with the decline in Sinn Féin support that we've seen since then. And I don't propose to go into that. We could probably spend the hour talking about the reasons for that. But if you just look at the consequences of that, so this time next year, Sinn Féin had two viable paths to government. And since the splintering of our politics, I think it's always useful to think about elections as almost a sort of a two-phase thing, because when we were growing up, you kind of knew who won the election after the first night of the count, because either Fianna Fáil could form a government or Fine Gael could form a government. But with the great splintering of Irish politics over the last 15, 20 years, it now typically takes months to put together a government after an election. And so that, you have the election and then you have the competition to put together a government afterwards. So that whole pathway to government idea, I think, is much more important nowadays. And 12 months ago, Sinn Féin had two viable pathways, as I said. They had at the head of a left-wing coalition without either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. That always struck me as much less likely of an outcome. But a year ago, with Sinn Féin on 35, 36%, it certainly wasn't beyond the bounds of possibility. The more likely route to government for Sinn Féin at that stage, and both people in Sinn Féin and in Fianna Fáil would have kind of acknowledged this privately at the time, was with a coalition between Sinn Féin and Fianna Fáil. Both of those outcomes, both of those routes to government now look much, much less likely. The Sinn Féin-led coalition of the left without either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael looks at this stage to be a very, very remote possibility. The Sinn Féin Fianna Fáil coalition looks not impossible, but it would take the sort of dramatic moves in the last week of a campaign that we have tended not to see. So if you look at where the polls are at the moment, and there will be a slew of polls this weekend, which will set the tone for the last week. And I'm probably not giving away any massive commercial secrets here if I say that, keep your eye on Monday morning's Irish Times for our last poll of the campaign. But speaking in advance of those polls, you would have to say that for that Sinn Féin Fianna Fáil pathway to government to open up, you would need a couple of things to happen. You would need a sharp increase in the Sinn Féin share of the vote in the weekend polls, indicating a momentum that those of us who are out every day covering the campaign don't see at the moment on the ground. And if you think back to the 2020 general election, when Sinn Féin did get that late campaign momentum, it was already evident on the ground. It's not now. So in summary, then, I think that, yeah, I mean, the landscape is transformed since a year ago. We're left with the situation where by far the most likely outcome of the election at this stage, a week out, is some form of the present government based around Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael being replaced. But I'll add one caveat to that, and I'm not Ivan Yates, so I always caveat my predictions, and that is that we still have a very high degree of voter volatility in this country. Levels of voter loyalty have declined massively in the last 20 years. That process seems to be continuing. If you look at the exit poll for the last election, showed that half of all people made up their mind in the course of the campaign, and 16% of them in the last week, 8% of them on the actual day of the election. So in some respects, the election is still there to be won and lost, but we have at this stage one outcome that is much more likely than the others.
Well, maybe Sarah, throw that to you in the sense of probably the most common phrase I've heard from people I've been talking to is that it's a relatively calm or even boring campaign compared to what we might have been used to in recent general elections, and that nothing has really changed so far in the campaign. Is that what you're seeing as well in terms of the mood?
Well, in the first week of the campaign, I found myself deeply irritated by the squabbling between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, because what I thought we were going to head into was, a relatively good-natured relationship between the two parties, who were obviously, by the wishes of the people and consents, going to be returned together, possibly in relatively even numbers. And I was surprised by the degree of the bad-temperedness between them. So I did notice that little incident down in Carey last week when Simon Harris went over to Micheál Martin and shook his hands, which apparently Fianna Fáil didn't particularly like. But I thought it was actually an important signal to send to people. There is going to be an organic transfer between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. The incumbency problem that Fine Gael have, where I think is it 55 of their candidates are brand new, is obviously going to be a huge big problem for them, irrespective of the Harris bounce, which is actually slightly deflating as time went on. And I had been certainly encouraging Fine Gael to go a lot earlier than they did in this election. I think the shine started to go off Simon in the last few weeks. Micheál Martin was stalling Fine Gael on that drive for the election, and I think that's been to Fianna Fáil's advantage. So Fine Gael may have been hoping that they were going to get a big enough of a jump on Fianna Fáil that maybe there were even some daydreams of finally ditching the rotating Taoiseach. I don't think that's happening now. The gap is closing, and if Fianna Fáil are running candidates in constituencies where the name is recognised and there's a new Fine Gael candidate, I think they may get a seat bonus from that. So instead we're left with, well, if they don't make the majority between them, which they may not do, who's going to be their potential coalition partner? Now, personally, I'm very sorry at the prospect that there won't be a Green voice in a potential coalition. I'm particularly sorry to see Eamon Ryan leaving politics, and hopefully he did enough in embedding climate change targets and policies behind him, that a lot of the work cannot be undone because climate change is an emergency. On the volatility factor, we're looking at Labour. And I was speaking to some of the, election nerds with their spreadsheets and everything over the last few days, and they are literally saying to me, Labour could get 10 or they could get 1 or 2. Like that. So that volatility is really impacting on those smaller parties. Maybe a lot of Green candidates will survive. And then the third potential coalition partner is Independent Ireland. And, we saw that leaders debate on Monday night where I watched the first half hour of it. And when the parade of leaders was going in, I think I was like a lot of people going, what? How are there 10 party leaders? Why is Joan Collins here? And Michael Collins was there because Independent Ireland is no longer separate independent TDs. It's a registered political party. And I think in that debate, everybody did what they needed to do, including a very enjoyable performance by Richard Boyd Barrett with the arms folded, looking around going, this is all a farce, which in some ways it kind of was. But everybody saw what they wanted to see in it. Nobody made a mistake. And I think maybe there'll be an opportunity next week with the three leaders to see, will that shift a dial? Will Simon Harris and Micheál Martin be able to disagree with each other just enough to have that race between those two big parties? Or will they be so divisive that people will get annoyed with them and go and vote for an independent? Will they gang up too hard on Mary Lou McDonald because Sinn Féin has been making a quiet recovery? So that's where the real, I think, competition is in the makeup of government. And the other big issue, of course, is independence and how angry will people be. I'm writing about that in my column in the Irish Independent tomorrow. On top of the micro parties, so say the Joan Collins Right to Change or the Independent Ireland, there are 172 non-party candidates. 20 of those probably will get in, and they'd roughly be the same 20 that are already in the Dáil. So the Michael Lowrys, the Verona Murphys, the Healy Rays, people like that. But there are another 24 that Adrian Kavanagh from Maynooth tells me are in with a chance to get in. So that just leads to both chaotic opposition and hopefully not a ransoming of cabinet positions in a month's time, where local chieftains are getting a cabinet job rather than a coherent government being put together. And just one more thing in terms of the campaign itself, what I've been astonished by is the degree to which the immediate existential threat has not been an election issue, and that's Howard Lutnick and Trump, because all of the ridiculous auction politics that's been going on, which has just, I think, brought the whole thing into disrepute, will be threatened if our corporation tax is hurt. And I'm amazed that has not been featuring more, and what are each of the parties going to do about that?
What I'm taking out of that, Sarah, is that in terms of your highs and lows so far, is Richard Boyd Barrett and his, calling it as the farce that it was in terms of 10 leaders.
And sorry, and a little mention for Michael Collins's chest hair too, which was very distracting on the night. That was very enjoyable as well.
Sarah, I will leave your own personal preferences to one side for the moment and go to Pat and say, from your point of view, Pat, what was your favourite moment so far in the campaign, and maybe what you would consider maybe the lowlights as well? Beat that.
Yeah. Transfixed by Michael Collins's chest hair. I mean, The mind boggles. But actually, I thought the debate was a bit of a farce in some ways, right? There's too many people on it. And it kind of really deteriorated in the second half of it. But actually, as a portrayal of the campaign, we didn't find out anything new about the campaign. But as a portrayal of it, I thought it was quite accurate in a way, because we had Simon Harris standing beside Micheál Martin, the pair of them, well groomed in their blue suits and white shirts, strong primary color ties, standing there, essentially backing one another up, saying the same thing. They're surrounded by the smaller parties, or some of the micro parties, as Sarah says, and they are all jostling for attention. And then over at the far extreme is Mary Lou, and she's trying to get into the debate. She's trying to take the big guys on, but she keeps getting distracted by the smaller guys and their swabbles. And in a way, that's been the sort of the story of the first half of the campaign. I think that changes in the final week. I spoke a little bit earlier about how the polls will sort of set the bar of where we are for the weekend polls, and our poll early next week will sort of set the bar for where we are. I actually think that the second debate between the leaders, which is on primetime on Tuesday night, I think that could be really important, because I still think there is a lot of votes that are floating around and maybe won or lost in the last week or so. And if you look at the history of election debates. They're often quite decisive in these sort of campaigns. I mean, the campaign that everybody seems to be comparing this to is 2007, Bertie Ahern's third election debate, where the government wasn't exactly loved, but people really didn't view the alternative as being a safe bet. And in a way, you can see how those similarities apply to today. I mean, from my point of view, the alarming point about that comparison is what happened after 2007. So wouldn't you think it would be an idea if 2007 is the parallel to figure out what might be coming after that? But I suppose that's a related subject we can we can
certainly,
get onto.
I think there's a lot of warning signs there. All right, there's no doubt about it. Yeah.
But on the point about the debates, is that the last debate between Bertie Ahern and Enda Kenny in 2007 was very influential in that late swing back to Fianna Fáil in that campaign. And so I think, you know, there's a plausible scenario whereby, let's say, the weekend poll. So in our last poll, we saw Fine Gael coming back a little. Simon Harris approval ratings, which had been very high, coming back a bit outside the margin of error. If that trend was continued at the weekend polls and early next week, then suddenly you have a little bit of pressure on Simon Harris and Fine Gael. And bear in mind, Mary Lou and Micheál Martin have been through this before. Simon Harris hasn't. If his party is still out ahead, but the margin of that lead has been trimmed a bit, then he not alone has a bit of a target on his back, but he's feeling the pressure. And I think they will go for him in that debate, and how he reacts to that and how he closes out in the next week or so, I think that could matter a lot when it comes to who gets their nose ahead as between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael.
It's interesting you use the word they, Pat, that they would go from, that you would see that coming from both his coalition partner as well as the opposition in that circumstances. Is that your perspective, that it would be advantage to both of them to go after Harris in that circumstances?
I think Mary Lou will go for the two of them in a really aggressive fashion. She had a couple of really good debates in the last election campaign in 2020, and she is a formidable campaigner. And there's a sort of, I mean, you're talking to reporters who are out every day covering the campaign. You do get different perspectives. From my perspective, I think Mary Lou has got her mojo back a little bit. Others that are following her on the campaign trail, probably more closely than I am, would tend to say that no, she's very protected. She's very good in controlled environments, and she's doing that very well, but she's not the kind of bullish, confident campaigner that she once was. Irrespective of that, which account of that you believe, I think she has to go for them and will go for both of them. But you're right, it's a really interesting point of how do Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael manage that competition in the debate. I don't think they will be as aggressive towards one another, but there will certainly be competition. And, you know, talk to Fine Gael people and Fianna Fáil people all throughout the campaign. I mean, you know, for 75% of the time, they are talking about each other as their principal opponents. And I always wondered over the course of this campaign, and indeed before the campaign, how Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were going to manage that dynamic of being partners in government, but also rivals for many of the same votes on the ground. And I wondered if there was going to be, you know, some sort of like even a tacit agreement or a common approach to it. It turns out, no, they just went for one another in the first couple of weeks. Now they go for one another in the knowledge that most people expect them to be back in government after the election. But I don't think they'll be too chummy with one another on Tuesday night, because they will know that debate could be really important in deciding which of them gets the highest number of TDs, and therefore which of them is in pole position to be Taoiseach first time round.
Yeah, I suppose, Sarah, maybe it's the old adage as well, is that local competition, that it's 43 local elections in the 43 constituencies right around the country, that the polls will show trends. And certainly the feedback I got from other places is that there's a difference between what's happening in Dublin and the rest of the country, that there's a little bit more of an edge and a little bit more anger outside of Dublin and a bit of a calmer campaign in Dublin. Is that what you're hearing as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, and a lot of those independents that we're seeing are a function of rural, a backlash against, say, climate change policies in a sense of being forgotten, and infrastructure, and also still the fallout from the referendums. Now, I know when I'm, chatting to people in the main political parties, they're going, oh, it's over, it's over. For a lot of people, it's not over. They're pretty angry about that. And that's where Sinn Féin had a problem, in that they were bleeding to the left and right of their support, because, of course, they had supported the referendums. I see, actually, bizarrely, in their manifesto, they're claiming they voted against the hate speech legislation, which became one of those touchstones, even though they voted for it and, in fact, wanted to expand upon it. So that's where that might damage them in rural constituencies, even if they're still recovering well in Dublin. And particularly as the focus, starts to move back a little bit towards housing. So it's those independents, I think, are the real unknown, and how will they do? Because in opinion polls, you see, when you have that 20%, that covers a multitude. It covers those small parties, it covers the real independents, and it's very hard to drill down into each actual constituency and who might do well. Or even within Dublin, like Kate O'Connell. I've heard two completely different sets of analysis from people in Dublin 6 talking about Kate. Some people saying, no, she's not got a hope. Other people saying she's been vaccinating the old ears of Dublin 6 for years. She's going to get a great vote, and wow, aren't those posters amazing? So, you really do just have to be prepared for anything. I think it is safe to say it will be Fine Gael, it will be Fianna Fáil in coalition. I think that gap will be narrowed between them. And then it's all about what happens to Labour/Greens/Independent Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if I could just jump in there, I think, though, that in this kind of last week dynamic that will start to take shape over the coming days, I think one of the real dangers for Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael is this sense grows that it's inevitable that they're going to be back. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why you will see competition between Simon Harris and Micheál Martin on Tuesday night to push back against the idea that this is a done deal. Because I think and I think to some extent it's inevitable that sense grows next week, unless something dramatic happens in the weekend polls, and that, it seems to me, is likely to push up the independent support, because people who don't want to see radical change, in the way the country is run, would be happy to have Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael there. But if they feel that it's a done deal, that they're going to be in government anyway, that sort of gives them a license to vote for independence. And that's the thing that Fianna Fáil, that's one of the things that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are really afraid of, I think.
And to that as well, that's the thing that might help a party like Labour, because now people feel they're voting for the third party and not for the main government party. And the other thing I'd love to be in on the conversation is they could go with Project Fear. They could go with Trump is coming. What the hell are you doing? Electing these jokers to government. We need a serious government. And I mean, I'd be saying tomorrow, we need Pascal Donoghue in the loop here. He's the only Irish politician who's ever been at a G7 finance ministers meeting. But Project Fears can also backlash and people don't like them. So if I were the strategist, I think I'd be having a lot of intensive meetings now over the weekend and decide what they're going to do with that last week. There really is a lot to play for to employ.
Well, I think I see some questions coming in, and I just want to assure people, if they do have questions, please put them in the Q&A box there, and we'll get to them. Most of the questions that are in so far are very much focused on the future and predictions about what the election might come to in terms of numbers, and we'll get there towards the end. I think we'll leave those predictions closer to the end. But it'd be worth just maybe, given the fact that we have an audience of solicitors right around the country with us today, thinking about justice and law reform in the political world. The manifestos, I think they've all been published, or certainly all the main ones have been published at this stage, and there's been a lot of policy launches. It'd be interesting, both, maybe starting with you, Sarah, and then Pat, around, and then I'll bring in Brian on this one as well, is how much is justice and law reform on the agenda in this election, in the manifestos, in the minds of politicians, given, I suppose, how important it is to the solicitors around the country on a number of issues, but where does it rank in the political world?
Will I go first on that?
Yeah, that'd be Sarah, yeah.
Okay, so funny, I noticed a letter by Alan Chatter in the Irish Times there. Was it last week, Pat, pointing out that it took 10 years or more to get the big legal reforms in the courts through after the Troika bailout and attempts to reform that. There seems to be a consensus around procedural reforms and reforms within the system. But I think the job for organizations such as yourself is that they have to be worked into any program for government that's worked out, irrespective of who wins. In terms of the actual campaign, the emphasis is far more on policing and the justice system. And everybody's answer to policing appears to be, oh, we need more training places. We're all going to open up a second training college. But of course, the reality of the challenge in recruiting Gardaí is that there are places and the recruits aren't showing up for them. And that's very typical when you have a booming private sector economy, that if you have young men and women who, can start off on a low enough entry salary to the Gardaí, and they've got much better opportunities in the private sector, they're going to lose out. So people are talking about doubling allowances and all of that. I'm not sure how impactful that might be. Then there are also other issues around civil liberties. So, for example, Helen McEntee has been defending herself, and she's really been on the ropes. Like, she's been the weak link for Fine Gael in this government and nearly lost her job. And I think everybody agrees it was Frances Fitzgerald saved it for her by an appeal to Simon Harris. So she's been touting reforms, for instance, that now Gardaí are wearing the body cameras, so they'll have footage of everything, and facial recognition technology. Some people are a little bit concerned how about that might be deployed. I think there's another issue which I would like to mention. People as well are talking about the jails. We need more prison spaces, the reopening of Thornton Hall. So it's this kind of right-wing approach to crime. But I'm worried about issues, for instance, the Mental Health Reform Act, where the threshold for involuntary committal for people who are severely mentally ill is proposed to be raised. And I've done some work on prisons. I've been in Clover Hill. I've been in the D Wing, which is one of the saddest places you'll ever be in this country, which is where people who have committed crimes when they were possibly in psychotic states and that are kept. And I'm very concerned about that Mental Health Reform Act, as are the families of people who suffer from severe mental illnesses. There are too many people who are mentally ill in jail. There are too many people who are drug addicts in jail. And I personally would love to see far more emphasis on preventing crime through more rehab for drug addicts and better care for people who are severely mentally ill, because putting them in jail brings us right back to pre-Victorian times. But that is not the mood. People don't want to hear that now. They want to hear about Thornton Hall, and they want to hear about more cops, and they want to hear, that harder approach to policing and to justice. So that's the way the mood is going, and it's one I regret, but that's the issue.
Pat, I suppose the same question to you. What prominence do you see justice and law reform having so far in the campaign, or any prospect of it having even more prominence in the week ahead?
I mean, I think you have to think of it in terms of the election campaign, and I agree with very much of what Sarah said there. In terms of an election campaign, what is important in justice issues is always more guards on the street. People have fear of crime. There's a real sense, and I think this is true in not just in Dublin, but in a lot of sizable rural towns around the country. There is a feeling that, I know there was focus on Ballahadreen recently. I'm from Clonmel and Tip. You hear it the same. You hear it there all the time, that the streets of these small towns are not safe because there has been the rapid permeation of drugs into rural Ireland in a way that wasn't there certainly when we were growing up, and that has all sorts of knock-on consequences on the streets of those towns. And at the same time, people feel that there are fewer guards around, and certainly fewer visible guards around. And if you look at the Garda numbers in terms of proportion of population, then they have a point. So you look at the manifestos, and there is lots of law reform stuff in it. And I suppose one thing that people in the media have been watching is the defamation bill and the prospects for that being restored to the order paper. Obviously went through second stage, but I think it is likely to be, certainly if Fianna Fáil Fine Gael back in government, it's likely to be restored to the order paper and progressed in the early part of the next government. And several other kind of related law reform issues that are in the manifestos. And then the question is how much of a priority they will be in the construction of a program for government. So going back to that kind of two-stage idea of what we're at here in choosing the next government, there's the electoral competition, and then there's the race to put together a Dáil majority. A lot of the law reform stuff, I think, belongs in the second stage of that process, whereas the first stage of the process is, 90% about numbers of guards and visibility of Gardaí.
There you go. That's maybe not a bad way to bring Brian in, because obviously, Brian, you've had a look at all the manifestos so far, but also been engaging with the political parties around, I suppose, the law societies, justice and law reform agenda. It'd be interesting to get your perspective on the policies that have come out through those manifestos. And I see there is one question in here around clinical negligence. I'm wondering if it's in the manifestos, but maybe if you can address that while you're making your broad comments as well.
Yeah, Mark, thanks for that. I think justice, it's been seen by governments of all shades as being something we must have and we must finance, but it's mainly about keeping things ticking over, not something to get particularly ambitious about. When you think back on the various, ministers for justice we've had, how many have been elected for promising to make the courts more efficient, or to make legal aid more widely available, or increase access to justice. The fact is, or the reality is, there, as Pat and Sarah have spoken about, the focus tends to be on crime and policing, and that's actually reflected in how the justice system is funded. And actually, when you look at the overall allocation of funding to the justice system, it almost kind of puts you in your place, because it reminds you that justice actually isn't a really key priority for government. And that's the way it's been when you look back over many years. The total level of exchequer funding across all departments for this year is in the region of 108 billion. And the amount of that allocated to justice is about 3.6%. So that really puts it in perspective. And the bulk of the justice spend actually goes on policing and goes on prisons, and only 5% is spent on the courts. So, the issues that people care about, that politicians care about, is actually mirrored to a great degree in how funds are allocated within the justice system. So that is very, very interesting to see. But justice, look, though we're saying, and we can recognize that it's not a top priority for politicians, it does feature quite strongly in the manifesto. So we've extracted all of the various justice commitments that have been made by the political parties, and they run to over 40 pages in a Word document. So there's a lot being said. And what's going to be interesting there, as Pat has alluded to, is what's going to make it into the programme for government. So as you've kind of mentioned there, Mark, we have been engaging with political parties. We put together the Law Society's policy priorities into a document, and we've been engaging with various political parties as they've been putting together their manifestos. And I guess the rationale for that was that if we could get political parties to reflect Law Society policy priorities in their manifestos, it would position us very well to have some of those reflected in the programme for government. Mm. So looking at the manifestos that have been published, I think we've fared fairly well. We see a lot of our policy priorities are reflected in the various manifestos, and when we think about some of our high priority issues, one of them is enduring powers of attorney. We had asked all of the main parties to commit to creating a solicitors portal so that solicitors could assist clients in making an enduring power of attorney. And it's great to see that in Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Labour and Sinn Féin manifestos, they've very much reflected the asks that we had engaged with them on. And we see that across a number of areas. So, for example, court reform and modernisation, you see that reflected quite strongly in the Fine Gael manifesto. Fianna Fáil, they speak about reform of the civil procedure rules. Fine Gael talk about review of the criminal justice system to speed up criminal trials and cut waiting times. Labour talks about modernising the courts infrastructure. And several parties have also reflected our call to deliver and accelerate the delivery of the new family courts complex in Dublin. And again, we see in areas such as legal aid, a commitment to broadening the range of circumstances in which civil legal aid is available, restoration of the criminal legal aid fees, e-conveyancing, a commitment to streamline aspects of the conveyancing process. So across a range of areas, we're seeing law society policy priorities being reflected, which makes us optimistic. As I say, that it's not a done deal. It just positions us well to ensure that those policy priorities are reflected in the programme for government. And so that's something that we will be following through on once the negotiating teams are identified.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the good point there that both yourself, Pat, and Sarah, I think you've all made it, which is the reality is at this stage, you're in the manifesto, you're in the electioneering, get the votes in the ballot box business right now. And then once the seats are determined, that both the arrangements for government and the policy that is pulled together is worth considering. And I think we could move on to that sort of phase now, and maybe in that conversation that you've set the scene well for what has been going on in the campaign, the lead up to the campaign. And I suppose we probably need to get into the meat of some of the discussions and some of the questions we have coming in here as well around what we can expect in the next week. Obviously, we've talked about polls and debates, but this day next week, people are putting votes in ballot boxes. And when those tumble out on Saturday morning as the tally men and women start to predict what's going to happen, who wants to put their hand up and say, what are you expecting to see?
I'll let Pat go first.
Sarah, take that question.
No, off you go, Pat.
I mean, it's we're nearly there. When we see going around covering the campaign, you see all the kind of bedraggled poor staffers from the political parties every day. I was up at a Sinn Féin thing earlier on, and they're all looking a bit shell-shocked. I think Mary Lou had a tough outing on Claire Byrne this morning. I didn't hear it, but I saw a lot of chatter about it. And I was walking back down to Tara Street, and I was going over the Rosie Hackett Bridge, and there was a bunch of Labour people doing a thing there. They were, I think they were. I was like their commitment to Dublin or something like that. Actually, it looked more like the commitment they were in need of was woolly hats, because they picked the coldest spot in Dublin to do their doorstep this morning, all of which is by way of saying, we are now heading into the decisive point and all the politicians are tired. We had Simon Harris in here for a podcast yesterday. We had Micheál Martin in here for one this morning. Both of them are still bouncing around. The guys that are following them are looking pretty bedraggled. All that being said, you always
I have a lot of sympathy for those people. Yeah.
I can imagine that you might.
Yeah.
I can imagine that you might. But things always step up in the last week. And what you would expect to see is, again, aided by the weekend polls, is that the shape of the next government becomes more of an issue in the last week. So, after the early sniping of the first week, second week is, more policy focused. And then the third week, I think, is more likely to be dominated by two things. One, the leaders' debate, and secondly, then the questions about the formation of government. And although you would expect, as you go to the last week, with the leaders' debate, it's more and more dominated by the big three parties. I think the state of this race and the questions about government formation, and in particular the role any of the smaller parties and our independents might play in the construction of a government that's centered around Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, I think that keeps them in the conversation. So if I was in one of the smaller parties, I wouldn't be afraid of that. I would be talking about government and red lines a lot more in the last week, purely to keep yourself in the conversation, because with all those votes, as we've noted repeatedly, with all those votes still to be finally decided on, if you're a small party, a small edge can give you a big advantage over your competitors. I mean, there's a couple of small parties, Labour, Social Democrats, the Greens, throw in the Independents, etc. And, Sarah mentioned it earlier, you can be on 4, 5, 6%, and you could be looking at 2 seats, or you could be looking at 10 seats. And the margins for that are so close. They're so tight. I mean,
okay, Pat, I'm going to stop you now. This is all a very wind-up position to getting down to some brass tacks, and I'll put some questions to you, actually, which I think are well put here. There's one in from the sunny southeast, which is probably not very sunny at the moment. Look, saying that Fine Gael traditionally fade in the last few days of the campaign. Do you expect Fine Gael to fade in the last couple of days of the campaign and the last week of the campaign? And there's another good question, which I'll put to both of you as well, which is around the world, we've seen that there's not a single governmental party that has increased their votes in the last 12 months and last 24 months, as far as I know, and I've seen various studies done on this. And are we going to see either a sort of a Trumpian surge here, and as it's put in the question from Simon, or are we going to see a scenario where we're going to buck the trend? So in the predictions of the last week, do we see that Fine Gael slip or government slip, or do we see a surge in support for people going to the comfort of what they know in terms of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil? So there you go.
I think the race will tighten in the last week, and I would be surprised if we didn't see that. And I know there's this thing about Fine Gael hasn't had good campaigns for the last 2 campaigns. This campaign didn't start off too well, but it's a different leader. I don't think there's anything inevitable about that, but I do think the race will tighten as between the big 3 over the course of the last week. The second point that you make, a second question about governments everywhere being losing seats. That's absolutely true, and it's actually, I think the message from that is a really important one in this way. It's that the reason that this government is performing strongly in this election campaign and has been strong in the opinion polls, I think one of the principal reasons for that is that it has had all these billions of euros in corporation tax money to throw at the cost of living over the last 3 years. It has, you've had massively expansionary budgets, plus the one-off cash benefits for people. And I think that has neutralized the political dynamics that inflation has wreaked upon other sitting governments, and I think that will continue throughout this campaign. But it also shows you the importance, and I'll finish on this point, shows you the importance of politicians being asked and answering the questions of what happens if those corporation tax revenues begin to drain away.
And Sarah, your idea, what's your perspective on what we might see in the next week? Do we see a tightening, as Pat has said, a fall in Fine Gael, or a surge towards independence? All seem to be possibilities. And then we get to some seat predictions, I'm sure, at some point too.
I always remember a key moment in the 2007 election, and Bertie Ahern was on the ropes in the tribunal, and Fine Gael was looking very, very strong. And there was a moment that I called the shirt sleeves press conference, and it was Brian Cowan, Noel Dempsey, and I think Dermot Ahern, and they were down in the Fianna Fáil press HQ election headquarters, and they had their shirt sleeves rolled up, and they were raging. They were absolutely raging. And they gave this press conference. The vibe and the actual words even used was very much, what are you thinking? You're going to let these jokers into government? Don't be ridiculous. They are not capable of governing this country, with all that's coming at us. And I remember watching it, and as a confirmed blue shirt, even I was scared at that moment. And we know how that went. And I'm wondering, would Simon Harris be brave enough to try a moment like that and say, fine, you're all in a bad mood, But could we focus on the real problem here and on the fact that we are being targeted, not just by Trump, but a lot of EU fellow member states who are not happy that we are grabbing tax that they feel entitled to. And this is the existential threat. And are you actually going to vote for a bunch of independents or a small party who may or may not go into coalition and put all of this at risk? Really? Or will they go, oh, no, we better not try that. We'll just try and keep buying the election and tell them how much money we're going to get and slagging off Sinn Féin and hope that sees us through. And personally, I'd love for a bit of drama more than anything else and for a bit of honesty, a bit of truth is to actually see that being said and see a moment like that and then see, will the big whale of the middle class do what they do in 2007 is when they're scared, you retain the status quo. Will they do that? Or will they feel comfortable enough that actually they're okay to have their little kick, at the elite establishment and the illiberals, by voting for their independent or whatever it is, or taking a risk that they can vote for the coalition partner rather than the government itself. So it would be really interesting to see. And I see some of your questions there. Was it Ray is talking about, FFFG becoming one? Look, obviously we're not there yet, but, I do often say to people, I remember John Bruton saying this 30 years ago, people often complain in Ireland, oh, it doesn't matter who gets in, because actually the policies are all going to be relatively simple. That, of course, has been our greatest strength. And that is why we're one of the richest countries in the world, that we don't have that extraordinary polarization, that while we're talking about volatility for parties, actually, broadly speaking, even the so-called left-wing parties agree with the fundamental economic model of the low corporation tax. And so, we can slag it off, but we can take comfort from. What I am concerned about is, at least when it was Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, there was always an alternative government. There was always an opposition ready to take power. And the real problem in Irish politics now is not Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. It's the fact there's no coherent opposition, this fragmenting of the hard left and of the soft left. The Soc Dems should not exist. That should be a reasonably robust and decent Labour Party. So the people who abhor, the IRA connections with Sinn Féin, which I still do and will always be a red line for me, and a lot of people feel like that, they've nowhere else really to go, only in these bitty little parties. And I think that's where the focus should be, is on who is going to provide an alternative government in an era where Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, either separately or Leahy, are going to be the strongest contenders for government. So, interesting times.
No, interesting times. And maybe, look, let's have a bit of fun with predictions, okay? And I think the advantages of this is that nobody really knows, and there's so much still to go in this campaign. But if we look at the numbers from last time around, I might just go through them in terms of parties and just let's have a stab.
And sorry, Mark, don't forget, we've got 14 extra seats this time.
That's exactly what I was going to say. The advantage is we at one level, you can't be held on the basis that it was 160 the last time, we're 174 seats this time around. So it will change the dynamic. But if we start with, last time round, Fianna Fáil came in with 38 seats on just over 22% of the vote. And again, I'll go over and back and I'm just saying, do you see them coming in with more seats or more votes than those, or less in the circumstances? I'm not going to hold it. Pat, do you think Fianna Fáil could be more than 38 seats, more than 22% or less?
I think they will be more than 40 seats, maybe not that much more than 40 seats, but yes, more than 40. And I think they will be in the 22-24 range, maybe at the lower end of that.
And Sarah, yourself?
Yeah, I agree. I think
this isn't being recorded or anything, is it?
No, of course it is.
Oh, excellent. Okay.
No, I think Fianna Fáil are going to do well. I think they're going to have a seat bonus. And I think it's because of that incumbency issue that Fine Gael have. So I would see, and it's even possible on a bad day for Fine Gael, depending on how things go well, that they outstrip Fine Gael. But definitely, I think they'll be 40 plus.
Well, then you have Fine Gael, who came in at 35 seats the last time on just under 21% of the vote. So, Sarah, from your point of view, then how would you see that coming in?
Look, they could be okay, and they could get up to the 40, if things go well. Because to be fair to them, where the incumbents are being replaced, they are being replaced by candidates who had the local elections behind them and did very well. And also what will help them is the brand element of this. And this is what we saw with Sinn Féin in 2020, that people weren't voting for individual candidates. Sure, they didn't even know who they were. They were voting brand Sinn Féin. And has Simon Harris done enough for Fine Gael, that brand Fine Gael will be enough to give them that bit of a lift, even if they don't know the name of the person on the ballot paper.
Around 40 is what you're saying as well.
Yeah.
Pat, would you agree with that? And in
Yeah.
Fine Gael, and then I might ask you around Sinn Féin then and a couple of the others as well.
Substantially, I would agree with that. I think I think that the Harris effect, I think it compensates somewhat for the for the lack of incumbents. But the lack of incumbents is a really powerful dynamic. I mean, I know I was writing about this a while ago. A couple of political scientists tried to estimate the incumbency bonus, and obviously you've got to control for a whole lot of things, but their rough estimate was something like 14%. In other that, all things being equal,
Okay, wow.
you were 14% more likely to get elected if you were an incumbent, and that kind of feels about right. So that's a significant headwind for Fine Gael. Having said that, look at the latest polls. You know, they're a good few points ahead of Fianna Fáil. So I'm going to give a very boring answer and say I think they'll be, you know, in the early 40s, around that same sort of level.
Those are good. All we can do is estimate at this stage. So last time Sinn Féin had 37 seats off 24.5%, and the Independents had 21. Depending on how you count independents, but let's go with the Irish Times that I happen to be reading right now. They call it as 21 on just over 15%. Do you see them keeping those numbers, or obviously increasing, especially on the independent side, I presume?
I think there'll be more independents. I think there could possibly be substantially more independents. Could be up to 30 independents in this next Dáil. Now, it's impossible to talk of them as an homogenous group because they contain the most right-wing and the most left-wing people in Irish politics. And, you know, in the present Dáil, there's 3 different independent technical groups, and some of them will be up for government formation, others won't. But I think you will see. And one of the things to watch out about the independents is, do you see, because we saw it at the local elections in May, do we see, you know, a far right anti-immigrant candidate elected? There's a couple of places where they will be in the mix. I'm not sure it actually happens, but they're certainly in the mix of it. And when you come down to, caveat entered again, when you come down to guesstimating, you know, the 4th and 5th seat in constituencies, you're talking about the order of elimination, and you're talking about dozens of votes, and that's impossible to predict. My gut tells me that maybe there won't be a breakthrough, but I wouldn't be amazed if there is.
Sinn Féin 37 the last time round. What would you predict this time around, roughly?
And you see, the thing is, Mark, you have to remember how many extra votes Sinn Féin got last time. So their vote could be halved, and they could still hang on to their 37 TDs. You know, now they may not, but they can take a huge hit and still come out all right. Now, I think they will take a hit. You know, I'd see them coming in maybe more early 30s, you know, rather than up, you know, that 37. And on the independents, we have the existing 21. I could see nearly all of them being returned, and absolutely could see an extra half dozen in there. By the way, one little extra thing that maybe people need to keep an eye on is the 2% threshold. This is the threshold that parties have to get their funding back. And it's interesting to see how different parties are managing that. So Aontú is running candidates, I think, in every constituency. And a couple of hundred votes in a constituency, even where they don't get their candidate in, could mean that they hit the 2% of the overall vote and get funding. The gender quota has also been playing a huge part in certain candidate strategies, remembering as well that what the gender quota says is that at least 40% of each gender have to be running. So I think the Greens were very close to actually losing their funding because they had too many women or something like that. So, and that has been playing a role in candidate selection. And that could end up, it'd be very interesting to see when the dust settles how much that's a factor.
Well, you mentioned the Greens there. So they have 12 seats in the previous election. How would you see them coming back this time around?
I mean, I think the best case scenario, I think might lean more on Pat for this, could be maybe 5, half a dozen is the best case. Is it, Pat? Is that what you'd have?
I would say the best case is a bit higher for them. I think there's a couple of places where they're definitely goosed. I can't see them holding a seat in Limerick. I think it's very difficult in Waterford. I think the new Fingal East is 3-seater. It's really difficult for Joe O'Brien to hang on there. But on a good day, and my base case for the Greens has always been that I think there would be more people at this election who are worried about climate change than there were at the last election. Now, that doesn't guarantee the Greens anything, but it gives them an audience to talk to. And I think that, look, I think the constituencies to watch are places like Dunleary, you know, so there's a real push on there for Fine Gael to get a second seat through Barry Ward. And if there's going to be that sort of Harris hop, though I hate the term, but if it's going to manifest itself, it's going to manifest itself across, you know, South Dublin, where, you know, the traditional Fine Gael strongholds are at their bluest, if I can. And so I think, you know, can Oisin Smith hang on there in the face of a challenge for Barry Ward? I think, you know, we've been trying to identify a couple of individual bellwether constituencies like that. I think that's one of them. On a good day, I think the Greens I think they can hang on to 7, 8 seats, maybe even 9
What
seats.
do you think about Hazel Chew?
Pickup.
Pat, would you give a pot about Hazel Chew in Dublin Bay South? That's a tough constituency.
I think the last seat comes down to a scrap between her and Chris Andrews. And again, like you know, that's a good constituency to focus on. It's a good one to watch next Saturday to see how those tallies are coming in, because if the Sinn Féin vote has collapsed to the extent that Chris Andrews is in difficulty, then Hazel Chew is a really good vote getter at local elections, but has to contend in that constituency with Ivana Bacik, who's kind of fishing in the same sort of pool as well. I know there were worries in Fianna Fáil about Jim O'Callaghan in that constituency. I think those have stabilised a little bit. For my money there, the last seat is between Sinn Féin and the Greens. And whoever wins it tells you a lot then about the sort of day that those two parties are going to have.
And then you're talking about Labour and Soc Dems, both of whom are talked as potential coalition partners, or any prospects for those. Both came in with 6 on the last occasion.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying at the start, Mark. It could be 2 or 10, and I just don't know. I really just don't know. I cannot call that one. They could do well, could do okay. Or Ivana Bacik could end up losing her seat. Like, it's that crazy out there. It really, really is. Pat?
I mean, I think it's unlikely that Ivana Bacik loses her seat. I mean, never rule anything out. I think that's unlikely. I think the Social Democrats they've got three big problems. They have 6 seats and they have 3 big problems. Actually, they have 4 big problems. I think Gary Gannon could be in difficulty in Dublin Central. He's got a strong Labour challenge. He now has Claire Daly there as an independent. I think she does him damage. So I think that's a really competitive constituency. And it's got its 2 co-leaders retiring. So it's a struggle to hold that seat, particularly 3-seater in Dublin Northwest. That's a struggle for them. Also in Kildare, where Catherine Murphy is retiring, I think they have a slightly better chance there. And then they've got the party leader who is about to give birth. Not the
ideal today. She's actually due today, yeah.
Not the ideal preparation for an election campaign. And remember that the last time in Cork Southwest, she almost got elected by accident. There wasn't a strong Sinn Féin candidate. You'd always expect there to have been a Fine Gael seat in that constituency. It didn't happen that time. I think Michael Collins, the independent, is safe there, so she'll be trying to hang on to that seat. And it's touch and go. Now, they did have a reasonably good local election result down there, and my gut tells me that if I was to call that, I haven't been down there, but if I was to call that constituency, I would say Holly Kearns might get the bounce of the ball. But that's what it is. It's a bounce of the ball. And the Social Democrats, they've potential pickups in a couple of places, but they could be coming back minus their leader and without a couple of seats. So Labour is in a slightly better position than that.
Okay. Well, look, thanks for your time today. Look, I mean, there was loads more questions I could have got into here. I'm just conscious of the time, and we could have gone on for a lot longer. And both to Sarah and Pat in particular, thank you very much, and to Brian for joining us as well to just give us the law-sided perspective on the manifestos as well. There's a week to go. We'd certainly encourage everyone to vote. And it's going to be fascinating. I'd certainly be interested with the popcorn, putting my feet up, watching some of the results on Saturday, which is a bit more relaxed than I have been in previous elections, which I'm glad to enjoy it on this occasion. Look, again, Sarah, Pat, Brian, really appreciate the time, the insight, and the interest in the topic clearly is widespread, and look forward to talking to you both and Brian, obviously, again soon. Cheers.
Thank you,
Thanks
Mark.
for having us.
Thanks to everybody for sharing your lunchtime with us today for what has been an absolutely really lively debate. Some of the questions coming in are complimenting me on that, so thank you. Just to avoid any doubt, Pat, today is being recorded and we will send it out to those who registered, who couldn't make it, and to everybody who's on the call today. And the next one in the series is on the 12th of December with Danny McCoy, our CEO of IBEC. So that's all for today, and thank you very much for joining us. Bye now.